Hello. What kind of thing do you most like to read? If you're anything like me, then you've got a variety of tastes for what you like to read. But I think for a lot of people, top of their list will be something like a real fast-moving, page-turning thriller. And when you open the New Testament and start reading Mark, actually it reads like a thriller. It hurtles literally from scene to scene as Mark recounts the story of Jesus. It's almost breathless in its pace. I'm going to read now from our reading from Mark 1 that we heard read. Only this time I'm reading from this translation called The Bible for Everyone by Tom Wright. And it, I think, conveys that sense of urgency. So try to catch that sense of urgency as I read today's passage now. This is how it happened. Around that time, Jesus came from Nazareth in Galilee and was baptized by John in the River Jordan. That very moment, as he was getting out of the water, he saw heavens open and the Spirit coming down like a dove on him. Then there came a voice out of the heavens. "You are my Son. You are the one I love. You make me very glad." All at once, the Spirit pushed him out into the desert. He was in the desert 40 days, and the Satan tested him there. He was with the wild beasts, and angels waited on him. After John's arrest, Jesus came to Galilee, announcing God's good news. "The time is fulfilled," he said. "God's kingdom is arriving. Turn back and believe the good news." Let me repeat that final verse. "The time is fulfilled," said Jesus. "God's kingdom is arriving. Turn back and believe the good news." That's 3 exclamation marks in just one short verse. This was urgent. Believe the good news, Jesus said. As you look back at your own life, you can hopefully recall a moment or moments when you received some really good news. I'd like you to think of just one of those moments now. So, did you think of something? When I thought about this question for the first time, I had 3 particular good news moments that came to my mind. Here's the first one.
The referee looks at his watch. Any second now, it will all be over. 30 seconds by. Watson, the Germans are going down and they can hardly get up. It's all over, I think. No, it's... And here comes Hurst. He's got... Some people are on the pitch. They think it's all over. It is now. It's 4. Charlton. And the players bring themselves.
England 4, West Germany 2. England won the 1966 World Cup. That was really good news. Sadly though, it's a feat that is still yet to be repeated. My second piece of good news was this.
The surface appears to be very fine-grained as you get close to it. It's almost like a powder. Ground mass is very fine. I'm going to step off the laminate. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Oh, that looks beautiful.
That was in July 1969. Neil Armstrong walking on the surface of the moon. I can still remember how ecstatic I felt as I watched that particular piece of good news unfolding right before my eyes on live TV. But my third piece of good news was just 12 years later. It was in December 1981 and it was the birth of our first child. Now, I hope you too have as many of those good news moments as I have to look back on. But do you know what? even if we rolled together all of your good news moments, all of my good news moments into big one good news ball, it would be as nothing when compared to the good news that Jesus was announcing and that Mark was writing about in today's reading. And in our Christian circles, we often refer to this good news, don't we, of the gospel message. And I think we've used that phrase good news so often and with such familiarity that it's actually begun to lose its proper impact. This good news that Jesus was announcing and that Mark was writing about was a fundamental ramping up of God's eternal plan for humanity. And it was and is, by many orders of magnitude, quite simply the most momentous news ever to have been received by the human race. So then, what precisely is this good news? Well, put quite simply, the good news that Jesus announced in verse 15 of our reading was this: God's kingdom is here. God's kingdom is here. What did he actually mean by that? By his telling people that God's kingdom was here now, was he implying that in some way God's kingdom was not here previously? Well, I think yes, in a way. Up until the arrival of Jesus, God's kingdom was not fully here, at least not in the same way that it was going to be here now. And what Jesus was saying was that now, in him, God was doing something totally new. What had always been true, of course, was that God loved humanity and has always longed for people to love and trust him. But the radically new thing that Jesus was announcing here, the thing that Mark goes on to unwrap for us in the rest of his gospel, was that God has now sent his own Son among us on earth as a man, and then to die in your place and in my place, so that you and I might be reconciled to God, and that we might then enjoy the kind of life that God always meant for us to have, both here and now and into eternity. And in order for us to enjoy all of that, all we need to do is believe God's message, to admit that we need his rescue, and then to trust our lives to it. This then was nothing less than the arrival of the moment in time that the whole of the Old Testament had been looking forward to. Thousands of years of history, hundreds of years of prophecy were all now reaching their cosmically crucial climax. Because now, in Jesus, God was literally invading this present world. Because now, in Jesus, God was ushering in a new era of forgiveness, restoration, and a new life for all those who will receive it. And if that isn't good news, then I don't know what is. Now I'd like you to think again of one of those good news moments that you thought of earlier. What was the first thing you did after you received that good news? Do you remember? I know I do, particularly when I heard the good news about our first child being born. I literally couldn't wait to tell everyone. I had a long list of people to call and share this good news with. And I'm sure you too would experience that same sense of urgency when you heard the piece of good news that you just thought of. But wouldn't it be great if we had that same sense of urgency about telling people about this gospel good news? Why don't we? Well, one reason, of course, is that telling people about Jesus is not like telling people about the birth of a new baby. Telling people about Jesus is something which challenges them. It invites a response. And so I think we fear being rejected. But I think that's a risk that we need to take. What's at stake here is simply too important. Now, there are two other things in these verses I'd like to look at before I close. The first is in verse 9, where Mark writes this: Jesus came from Nazareth. Now, the people who would have been the first to read Mark's Gospel, people who would have known all about the local geography of the area, when they read those words, Jesus came from Nazareth, will probably have thought, excuse me, Jesus came from Nazareth? Where on earth is Nazareth? That's because Nazareth was a very little known town. In fact, Nazareth was never mentioned even once in the whole of the Old Testament. And you know, I think that's a source of great encouragement for us. The fact that God can, and often does, use the least known people who come from the least known places and backgrounds to do great things for him. And the second thing I want us to notice from these verses is this. In verse 9 it says, Jesus was baptized by John in the River Jordan. Now, just hang on a minute here. Jesus was baptized? Wasn't the baptizing that John was doing all about repenting and turning away from sins? But Jesus was without sin, wasn't he? So why did Jesus need to be baptized? Well, I think one reason was to be an example to his followers and to us, to show that they needed to be baptized. But I think there's an even more important reason. Jesus was baptized in order to identify himself with humanity. And when we think ahead in the gospel account to Jesus' suffering and death on the cross, we see how Jesus really did come to represent all of us. He came to stand in our place. And so by being baptized as a man, he was physically and spiritually identifying himself with you and with me. Of course, Jesus didn't need to repent of anything. He committed no sin. But by being baptized, he was identifying with us in order to be able later on to carry out the rescue mission that he had come to complete. Now, the sheer enormity and grace of Jesus' rescue mission, I think, can be made a bit clearer with an illustration. Now, this is far from a perfect analogy, but I think it does help our understanding of the importance of Jesus standing in our place, of his becoming one of us. I'd like to picture in your mind a courtroom. A man has committed a very serious crime, and he stands in the dock before the judge. The court has already found the man guilty of the serious crime, and the judge is now ready to pronounce sentence on the man. But then something quite unexpected happens. The judge, who has great compassion and love for this man, says to him, "Because of what you've done, you rightly deserve to be punished. But I love you so much that if you'll just say to me that you are truly sorry for what you did, and then if you promise to follow my good advice for the rest of your life, then you won't have to be punished at all. You can walk out of this court right now as a free man from this very moment." Well, obviously, the guilty man is gobsmacked by this incredible offer, which of course he then immediately accepts. But then he is even more gobsmacked when he watches what happens next. The judge takes off his wig, takes off his robes, and then steps down from his bench, is handcuffed by the guards, and led off to the prison to serve the sentence the man would have got. The Bible teaches that God is just like that judge in the scenario, and that you and I are just like the man, the guilty man. And just like that judge, God is a judge of both mercy and justice. Every single wrong or evil act ever committed by anyone will, sooner or later, have a justly deserved consequence. Now, had the judge in my illustration simply let the man off and left it at that, he would have shown mercy to the man, but that would have ignored justice. And God isn't like that. Justice has to be served. But God loved us so much that he came down as Jesus, took our place, and he suffered the penalty of death to pay for all of our rebellion against him. And that, I think, is what Jesus was preparing himself for when he was baptised by John. It was all part of this identifying with each one of us, representing us, so that later he will be able to fully represent you and me, to stand in our behalf when he went to the cross. And the Apostle Paul clearly describes this idea of identifying when he wrote about Jesus in his second letter to the Corinthian church. He wrote this: God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. So the creator of the universe came to live on this earth as a man, to be born, to grow up, to be baptized, to be tempted by Satan, and then to be rejected by everyone, and then to be put to death, to take upon himself all the bad stuff that you or I have ever done, said or thought. And then he paid the penalty for it all, just so that you and I could be reconciled back to God. And so, regardless of whether you've been a Christian for 70 years or just 7 days, I hope that you will marvel afresh at the sheer enormity of the good news that Jesus was announcing in this passage, and that we will all be moved again to thank God for the nearness of that kingdom that he announced, a nearness that is still here with us today. And I hope too that you would have a renewed eagerness to share this good news of the kingdom with others, and that you would ask God to help you to overcome any reticence or fear that you may feel in doing so. So thanks for listening. Amen.